The war ended quietly, not with the thunder of artillery, but with a strange, almost unsettling silence. The kind of silence that made men glance over their shoulders, waiting for the echo of a shell that never came. For the first time in years, the air over Europe carried no smoke, no metal, only the sound of wind moving through ruins. And in that silence, thousands of soldiers, those who lived through the unthinkable, stood still, unsure whether to feel relief or guilt for being alive. They were young once. Now they looked twice their age, eyes hollow from nights that had no morning. When the telegrams stopped arriving and the uniforms began to fade in the sunlight, America opened her arms to receive her sons. But the country they returned to felt different. The streets were clean, the houses intact. The laughter of children replaced the whistle of bombs, and yet, to the men who had crawled through mud and fire, peace sounded almost alien. They stepped off the ships with medals on their chests and ghosts on their backs. Some kissed the ground. Some looked up at the skyline and wept, and others just stared as if waiting for someone to tell them what to do next. The world called them heroes. They called themselves survivors. Sergeant Miller went back to Ohio, to the same porch where he had once sat with his father, dreaming of baseball and summer rain. The field behind his house had grown wild, tall grass swaying where corn used to be. He walked through it one evening, boots sinking into soft earth, and for a moment he swore he could hear the crunch of snow under his soles, the muffled laughter of his brothers in arms. But when he turned around, there was only wind and the long shadow of the setting sun. Cole found work in a factory outside Detroit. Machines now replaced the rhythm of mortars, and the clang of metal reminded him of gunfire. He didn't talk much. No one around him understood why he flinched when a hammer struck too hard. He kept a photograph of his unit pinned inside his locker, a single frozen moment of youth and mud and courage. Each day, as he wiped grease from his hands, he whispered the names that only he still remembered. Private Dawson didn't make it home whole. His body healed, but his sleep never did. He'd wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, heart pounding to a rhythm that no longer matched the world around him. The doctors called it nerves. He called it memory. He spent his days teaching at a small school in Kansas, telling his students about history but never about himself. When they asked if he was in the war, he'd smile faintly and say, "We were all in it one way or another." Years passed. The nation moved forward, new cars, new music, new wars. But for the men of Bastogne, time moved differently. The war didn't end for them. It only changed shape. It lived in the spaces between laughter, in the moments when rain hit the window just right, sounding like distant artillery. On the 10th anniversary of the end of the war, Miller received a letter. It was from Cole, a reunion, he wrote. "Let's see if the years have been kinder to you than they have to me." The words carried a familiar weight, half joking, half aching. Miller folded the paper, stared at the horizon for a long time, and decided to go. When he arrived at the small diner off Highway 6, he barely recognized the man waiting for him. Cole's hair had turned silver, his eyes still sharp but tired. They shook hands like strangers, then sat for hours saying little, letting silence fill the space where words once lived. Finally, Miller pulled out a small harmonica from his coat pocket, the same one he'd played by firelight in Belgium. He placed it on the table. Cole smiled faintly. "You still carry that?" Miller nodded. "Some things you don't put down." They talked until the sun fell behind the cornfields. About nothing. About everything. About the boys who never came home. About how every winter still felt like Bastogne. That night, as Miller drove back home, headlights carving through the mist, he realized something he'd never said aloud. The war had given him a family that time could never erase, but it had also taken the part of him that knew how to live without them. Years slipped by like the pages of an old diary. The men aged, but the faces in their memories stayed young. Every reunion grew smaller, the table more empty, the laughter softer. The stories they told became echoes of a time no one else could touch. To the outside world, they were old soldiers. To each other, they were still the boys who had crawled through snow and fear side by side. On a cold December morning, 20 years after Bastogne, Miller visited the memorial wall. Names carved into stone stretched endlessly before him, a sea of letters that felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. He found Dawson's name there. The teacher from Kansas had passed quietly in his sleep. No ceremonies, no headlines, just a folded flag and the whisper of his students saying goodbye. Miller stood in silence, tracing the letters with his fingertips. Around him, the wind carried the faint sound of church bells and passing cars. For a moment it felt as though the world had forgotten, but he hadn't. He could still see Dawson's face in the flicker of a campfire, hear his voice saying, "We were all in it." One way or another, Cole came up behind him leaning on a cane. "You found him," he said softly. Miller nodded. They didn't need to say more. The silence between them was the same one they had shared in the Ardennes, the kind that didn't need words. They sat on a bench overlooking the field beyond the memorial, the winter light pale and unforgiving. "You ever wonder," Cole began, "if all of it mattered? If what we did changed anything?" Miller looked down at his hands, rough and scarred. "I used to," he said. "But then I see my grandchildren play without fear, and I think, maybe that's enough." Cole smiled faintly. "You always were the optimist." Miller chuckled. "No, I just learned to hold on to the little things, the way we used to hold on to each other." The years continued to strip the world of the familiar. Old barracks became museums. Uniforms gathered dust behind glass, and history books condensed their lives into a few neat paragraphs. But the truth of it, the fear, the brotherhood, the quiet courage, lived only in those who had walked through it. In 1975, Miller received another letter, this one written in shaky handwriting from a veterans' hospital in California. "Cole was sick. Don't bother coming," it said. "Just promise me you'll play the harmonica one more time." Miller did. Sitting on his porch, as twilight settled over the fields, he lifted the small dented harmonica to his lips. The same tune he'd played decades ago floated through the air, a soft, trembling melody that carried all the weight of memory. His wife stepped outside, listening quietly. "It's beautiful," she said. Miller smiled faintly. "It's not mine," he whispered. "It's theirs." When Cole passed, Miller felt something inside him settle, not break, but rest. He took the old photo from his drawer, the one from the frozen fields, and placed it on his mantel. For the first time, he didn't feel haunted by it. He felt grateful. Grateful for the men who had walked with him through hell and back, for the nights they'd kept each other alive when the world around them was falling apart. The last reunion came in 1994. Only 3 of them remained. They gathered in Bastogne, now a quiet town with tourists and cafes where trenches once scarred the earth. Children ran across the same fields that had once held the dead. The air smelled of rain and soil, not smoke. They stood by a small monument erected in their honor, its inscription simple, "To the men who endured the impossible." Miller traced the words and felt a lump rise in his throat. "We were just kids," one of them said softly. "Kids who grew old too soon." That night, as they sat in the hotel lobby, Miller looked out the window at the stars above Belgium. The same stars he'd seen through smoke half a century ago. "Do you think they remember us?" he asked quietly. The others didn't answer. They didn't have to. Somewhere out there in the vastness of time, memory was enough. When he returned home, the war finally felt distant. Not gone, but resting, like an old wound that no longer hurt when touched. He spent his days tending to the garden, writing letters to the families of men who never came back, telling them not of glory or victory, but of kindness, of the small acts that had kept them human in inhuman times. In his final years, Miller often sat by the window with that same harmonica beside him, sunlight falling gently across the table. When he spoke to his grandchildren about the war, he didn't speak of battles or medals. He spoke of the quiet moments, sharing a blanket in the snow, hearing someone laugh after days of silence, watching the sky turn red at dawn, and realizing he was still alive. He died one autumn morning, the harmonica still resting near his hand. The paper beside him read simply, "We came home, but a part of us stayed there, to remind the world what it cost to be free." At his funeral, a boy placed the harmonica atop the folded flag. The sound of taps filled the air, clear and distant, like a memory carried by the wind. And as the camera of time pulled back, across the fields, the rivers, the ruins reborn, a single truth remained, that in every quiet moment of peace, there lived an echo of those who fought, who endured, who never let the darkness win. Because history is not made of dates or victories. It's made of men, ordinary men who did extraordinary things and then came home to teach the world how to live again. The war had ended, but their story, Their courage, their silence, their brotherhood would never fade. They say wars end when the guns go silent. But for those who lived it, the sound never really stops. It just changes, from explosions to heartbeats, from screams to memories. Every sunrise reminds them of someone who didn't make it. Every quiet night brings back the faces of men who once called each other brothers. The world moves on. Cities rise. Children laugh. Flags fade. But somewhere, deep in the corners of an old soldier's mind, when that battlefield still breathes, the frost, the smoke, the endless waiting, the prayers whispered into the dark, and the promise they made to one another. If I make it home, I'll never forget you. Generations later, those stories live on, not in books, not in parades, but in the silence between two heartbeats. In the courage of a boy who stands up for what's right. In the tears of a widow who still keeps his photograph by the window. Because war doesn't end with peace. It ends when the world finally understands the cost of it, when it remembers not the glory, but the grief, not the victory, but the sacrifice, and maybe, just maybe, when we listen closely enough, we'll still hear them. The men who gave everything so we could wake up in a world they only dreamed of. Not heroes. Not legends. Just soldiers. Who loved, who feared, who endured. And in their silence, they taught us how to be human again.